The rain hit the windows of Hawthorne Manor, like fists demanding entry. Each gust of wind made the old house groan, and the fire in the parlor snapped and hissed like it was angry at being trapped. May Larkin stood near the heavy oak door with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles had gone white. She was trying not to shake, trying not to let them see how much this moment was tearing her apart from the inside. Across the room, her stepmother sat on the velvet sofa like a queen on her throne. Lenora Hawthorne's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes, the kind that said she had already won this battle before the first shot was fired. Her two daughters sat beside her in matching black morning dresses that still held their sharp creases, so new they practically announced their cost to anyone who looked. Vivian kept smoothing the fabric, like she wanted the whole room to notice how fine it was. Eliza stared at the floor, her fingers picking at a black ribbon tied around her wrist. May's own dress was old. The black had faded to a dull charcoal gray that looked more like ash than mourning. The seams at the waist were puckered, where someone had let them out twice as she grew. She could feel the rough places where it had been mended with thread that didn't quite match. No one in this room would mention it. They rarely mentioned her at all, except when they needed someone to blame for small household failures, or when Lenora wanted to remind everyone that May wasn't really family. Not the way blood made you family. Outside, the mountains of Colorado rose like gray ghosts behind sheets of rain. 3 days ago, they had buried May's father in the wet ground on the hillside cemetery. 3 days of this terrible silence filled with small, cutting looks that left marks you couldn't see, but felt all the same. 3 days of waiting for this moment, when the lawyer would read the will and May would finally know if her father had remembered she existed. Lenora tapped the brass clock on the mantel with one perfectly manicured finger. "The lawyer is late," she said. Her voice was smooth and loud enough to own every corner of the room. "How rude, with everything we've endured." Vivian made a soft humming sound of agreement. Eliza said nothing, but her cheeks flushed pink like she wanted to speak and couldn't find the courage. May's eyes drifted to the empty leather chair by the window. It had been her father's chair. He had spent his last months there, watching the mountain land he loved more than he had ever loved her. No one had sat in it since he died. No one would, as if the empty chair was a shrine to a man who had never been warm enough to deserve one. He never asked May to sit near him either. When he spoke to her at all, it was usually to correct something, a number on a ledger, a loose thread on his coat, a small mistake that proved she would never be enough. The clock struck 4, and footsteps hurried down the hall. A thin man in a rain-soaked coat stepped into the doorway, hat in hand, papers clutched tight, like they might blow away if he loosened his grip for even a second. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, breathless. "My apologies. The roads are washed out." Yes, Lenora cut in, waving him toward the writing desk like she was swatting a fly. "You're here now. Let's finish this." The lawyer swallowed hard and sat down. He laid out damp papers and smoothed them with shaking hands, like he could press the storm out of them. His eyes swept the room and stopped on May for half a second before sliding away. May felt that old familiar sting, the way people looked at her like she was a shadow on the wall, something you only notice if you stare too long. He cleared his throat. "The last will and testament of Silas Hawthorne, owner of Hawthorne Mining Company and Hawthorne Manor, written in sound mind on the 10th of June, 1873. May's fingers tightened in her lap. 10 months ago. 10 months when her father had been weak and coughing and angry at the world for letting him get sick. 10 months when he could have called her into his study and said one kind thing. He never did. The lawyer's voice turned into a steady drone. The mining company would go to Vivian's future husband, with rules that kept control inside Lenora's bloodline. The townhouse in Denver and a yearly income would go to Eliza. The horses and equipment would be divided between them. May listened like the words were falling into a deep pit inside her chest, one she had been trying to fill her whole life and never could. Then came the part that made the air change. "Regarding May Larkin," the lawyer said, and his voice shifted like he wished he could skip this line entirely. "No property is bequeathed." May did not blink. She did not move. She felt the sentence land in her chest, like a stone thrown from a great height. Lenora let out a soft laugh. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Everyone in that room heard it, and it cut through the air like a blade. "Well," Lenora said, turning her head toward May as if she were finally worth looking at. Her smile was thin and sharp as broken glass. "I suppose that settles it." Vivian stared at her hands like they had suddenly become very interesting. Eliza looked up once, quick, and her eyes flickered with something that might have been shame. Then she looked away again. Lenora's gaze held May like a pin through cloth. "You received exactly what you earned," she said, and every word was precise and cruel. "Nothing." May's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. She wanted to speak. She wanted to tell Lenora that she had kept this house running when Lenora was busy being admired in town, that she had balanced the accounts and mended the coats and stayed quiet through every insult because she had been taught that silence was survival. But she knew how this would go. Words were weapons in Lenora's hands, and May had no armor. So she stood. She rose with slow, careful dignity, like a woman who refused to give the room the pleasure of seeing her rush or stumble or break. "If you'll excuse me," May said. Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded so loud she thought they might hear it. She turned toward the door, already thinking of her small room, tucked behind the kitchen, the one Lenora had moved her into years ago, the one that smelled like soap and cold wood and felt like a punishment. She would pack her worn carpetbag. She would take her pencils and her mother's locket. She would find work in town if she could. Schoolhouse, laundry, anything. The door swung open before she reached it. A man stepped inside and brought the mountain weather with him. Rain dripped from his dark coat. His hair was wet and pushed back like the wind had fought him all the way here. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe, broad-shouldered, built like a man who worked with his hands and his back, not with papers and polite conversation. His boots hit the wood floor with a hard, steady sound that made the whole room go quiet in a different way, like even the storm outside paused to listen. Lenora stood so fast her skirt snapped. Her smile changed in a blink, turning sweet and nervous at the edges like sugar over something sour. "Mr. Rourke," she said, voice thick with false warmth. "What an unexpected visit." He didn't look at her. His eyes swept the room once. The lawyer, the daughters, the empty chair by the window. Then they landed on May, and the world seemed to tilt. May forgot how to breathe. No one had looked at her like that in years. Not like she was a problem. Not like she was a stain on the family name. Like she was a person. Like she mattered. The man spoke, and his voice was deep and calm, the kind that made other voices stop trying to compete. "I see I arrived on time," he said. Lenora's smile twitched at the corners. "Mr. Rourke, the will has been read. There's nothing more to discuss." "There is," he said, finally turning his head to her. His expression was cold enough to make the fire feel small. "Because you've been counting wrong." The lawyer's hands began to tremble. Papers shifted on the desk like they wanted to escape. Lenora lifted her chin, but there was something uncertain in her eyes now. "This is my home. My husband's will is lawful, and—" "Your husband's will is not the last word," the man said, cutting her off with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume. "Not where May is concerned." May's throat went dry. Hearing her name out loud from a stranger's mouth felt unreal, like she had stepped into someone else's story. The man took one step forward, and the room seemed to shrink around him. "May Larkin," he said, and the way he said her full name made it sound like something worth protecting. "Inherits my protection, and everything that comes with my name." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. May stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain this was some kind of fever dream brought on by grief and shock. Lenora made a sharp sound in the back of her throat. "This is absurd. Who do you think you are?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My name is Caleb Rourke," he said, "and I own the deeds your late husband tried to hide from you. The contracts he signed when May was still a child. The promises he made and failed to keep." The lawyer went pale, like the blood had fled his face all at once. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed packet, damp at the edges, but intact. He held it up so the room could see it, so there was no question about its existence. "Silas Hawthorne wrote to me 6 months before he died," Caleb said, and his voice was steady as stone. "He asked me to correct what he failed to fix in life." Lenora's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Silas never mentioned any. Of course he didn't, Caleb said, and now there was an edge to his voice like a blade being drawn. Because he was afraid of you. The words hit like a slap across the face. Vivian sucked in a sharp breath. Eliza's hands clenched in her lap, so tight her knuckles went white. May stood frozen near the doorway, her mind spinning. Her father had written to this man. Her father had asked for help. Too late. Always too late. But still he had tried. Caleb turned back to May. His gaze softened just a little, like he knew the weight she had been carrying and hated that she'd had to carry it alone. "Miss Larkin," he said, and the respect in it made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand. "I'm sorry you heard that word today. I'm sorry you were made to feel small in a room that should have honored you." May's lips parted, but no sound came out. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if there were words for this moment. Caleb held out his hand. It was big and rough, the hand of a man who chopped wood and held reins and built things with his own strength. Rainwater slid off his knuckles. His palm was steady and open, waiting. Behind May, Lenora's voice rose sharp with panic. "Do not take his hand. He's trying to steal you. He has no right." But what none of them knew yet was that Caleb Rourke had more than just a contract. He had a plan, and when the truth of that plan came to light in the next few minutes, it would shatter everything Lenora thought she had secured, because the real secret wasn't just about inheritance. It was about what Silas Hawthorne had promised 20 years ago, and what that promise meant for the future of everyone in this room. May didn't look back. All her life, she had stayed where she was placed. All her life, she had made herself invisible so she wouldn't be punished for simply existing. But now, someone was offering her a way out. Not a dream, not a pity gift. A door opening in the middle of her shame, and on the other side was something she had stopped believing in a long time ago. Hope. It scared her more than the storm outside, more than Lenora's cruelty, more than the emptiness of inheriting nothing. May swallowed hard. Her fingers unclenched slowly, like they were learning a new language. And then, like a woman stepping onto ice she wasn't sure would hold her weight, she lifted her hand and placed it in his. His grip closed around hers. Firm, warm, careful, not owning, not forcing, just holding, like her hand was something worth protecting. Caleb nodded once, as if he had been waiting for that answer all along. Then he turned his head toward Lenora, and his voice dropped into something that sounded like a promise and a threat all at once. "Pack her things," he said, "because she's leaving this house tonight." May's breath caught in her chest. Leaving. Tonight. The fire crackled. The rain kept beating against the windows, and Lenora's smile finally broke, turning into something ugly and afraid. May felt Caleb's hand tighten just a little around hers, like a promise made without words. But as the wind pushed against the walls of Hawthorne Manor, one thought raced through May's mind like a wild animal running for its life. What would Lenora do when she realized May wasn't a shadow anymore? And what would happen when the rest of Caleb's plan unfolded, and May discovered that her father's promises ran deeper than anyone in this room could have imagined? Caleb didn't let go of May's hand when he guided her out of that front room. He moved like the house belonged to him now, not because he was rude or arrogant, but because he was certain. His wet coat left dark marks on the air as he passed, and his boots kept that steady sound on the wood floor. Every step felt like a door closing behind May, sealing off the life she had known. Lenora followed them into the hall, her voice still sweet on the surface, but shaking underneath, like thin ice over deep water. "This is madness," she said. "You can't just take her." Caleb didn't even turn his head. "I'm not taking her," he said. "She's leaving." May's throat tightened. That single sentence put a new shape around her entire existence. Leaving was something other people did. Not her. Not the girl who had been trained to stay quiet and small and grateful for the scraps she was given. They reached a side parlor with a smaller fire burning low in the grate. The light was softer here, golden instead of harsh. The walls held old landscape paintings and faded rugs that had seen better days. The air smelled like smoke and damp wool and something else May couldn't name. Safety, maybe, or the possibility of it. Caleb shut the door with his boot and finally released her hand, but only after he saw her standing steady on her own 2 feet. The lawyer, Mr. Hartwell, came in behind them, still clutching his papers like a drowning man holding driftwood. His face was pale, and his eyes kept darting toward the door as if Lenora might burst through it with a fireplace poker. Caleb set the sealed packet on a small table near the window. "Sit," he told the lawyer. Mr. Hartwell sat at once, like a dog obeying a command it didn't dare question. May stayed standing. Her hands felt cold. Her heart still beat too fast, like it was trying to catch up with what had just happened. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and his voice was quieter now. "You're safe in this room," he said. "No one will come in unless I allow it." May swallowed hard. "I don't understand," she managed, and her voice sounded small even to her own ears. "Why are you here?" Caleb took a slow breath, like he had been holding the answer in his chest for a very long time, and it hurt to let it out. "Because your father asked me to be," he said. The words hit May in a strange way, like a punch that didn't hurt but left her breathless anyway. Her father asked. The man who couldn't look at her during dinner. The man who signed her name on a ledger but never said it with warmth. That man had asked for help. For her. Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat, his voice thin and reedy. "Mr. Rourke, if I may, I wasn't aware of any." "You were," Caleb cut in, his voice still calm but hard as iron underneath. "You just didn't want to be." The lawyer's mouth opened and then shut again like a fish gasping on dry land. Caleb turned his attention back to May, and she felt the weight of his gaze, like sunlight after years in shadow. "Months ago, your father sent me a letter," Caleb said. "It came with a copy of a contract, a lawful one, signed and witnessed, filed where it needed to be filed." May's mind struggled to catch up, to make sense of words that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "A contract," Caleb nodded. "An old agreement, between your father and mine, made before you were grown, before your stepmother took this house and turned it into something that felt like a cage." May's cheeks burned. She hated that he could see it, that he could name the thing she had tried so hard to pretend wasn't true. Caleb's eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. "Your father owed you more than he gave," he said, and there was no sugarcoating it, no false comfort. He wrote that he knew it. He wrote that he was too weak to fight her the way he should have, but he begged me to keep the promise he broke. May's hands tightened at her sides. Anger rose inside her like heat from a fire that had been banked too long. "He couldn't speak to me," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the words. "Not once. Not when I was right there." Caleb's jaw worked, like he wanted to say something sharp, and then chose his words more carefully. "Some men ruin their own hearts by being proud," he said. "It doesn't excuse him, but it's the truth." May stared at the fire, watching the flames blur as her eyes stung. She refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. Mr. Hartwell shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under him. "What does this contract state?" he asked, and his voice was nervous, like he already knew the answer would complicate his life. Caleb opened the sealed packet with deliberate care. He pulled out papers with neat writing and dark seals pressed into wax that looked official and old and utterly binding. He set them down on the table like they weighed more than paper should. "It states," Caleb said, his voice measured and clear, "that May Larkin was to be provided for under my name when she reached adulthood, or when her father died, whichever came first." May's breath caught in her throat. Provided for how? Caleb's voice stayed plain, like he was reading from a list instead of changing the course of her entire life. "Land, income, a home, protection." Mr. Hartwell made a strange sound in the back of his throat, something between a cough and a gasp. Is this a marriage contract?" Caleb didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on May. "It can be," he said. "It also allows a settlement without marriage. May has a choice." May's head snapped up. A choice. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like food she had never tasted before. Have you ever been given a choice that felt too big to hold? A choice that could change everything, but also terrified you because you had spent so long believing you didn't deserve to choose anything at all. That's where May stood now, in a room that smelled like rain and old paper, holding a possibility she didn't know how to name. Outside in the hallway, Lenora's muffled voice rose, sharp and insistent. "Open this door. Do you hear me?" Open it this instant. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even glance toward the sound. He kept speaking to May. Not louder, not softer, like Lenora's voice was just wind against a mountain and meant nothing. Your father tried to bury this, Caleb said, and there was something like anger in his voice now. Controlled but real. He tried to keep your stepmother from finding out, because he thought she might soften with time. He thought she might learn to be kinder. May let out a bitter, small laugh before she could stop it. The sound was ugly in her own ears, sharp and broken. Caleb's eyes hardened. He was wrong, he said simply. And now he's dead. The words sat in the room like smoke, filling every corner with their truth. May pressed her fingertips into her palms, trying to anchor herself to something real. So why now? She asked, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. If this was real, if you had this contract, why didn't you come sooner? Caleb's gaze shifted, and for the first time, something flickered across his face that wasn't control or certainty. It was pain, old pain, the kind that had carved lines into a person's soul and never quite healed. He looked away, toward the fire, as if the flames made it easier to speak the truth. Because I had my own trouble to settle, he said quietly. A promise I made to a dying woman. A mess I had to clean up before I could bring you into my home, without it being another kind of trap. May didn't know what to say. Didn't know if she wanted to know the details of his pain, or if knowing would make this all feel too complicated, too heavy to carry. Lenora's voice outside turned sharper, frantic, like an animal caught in a snare. She belongs to me. She has no rights in this house. No rights at all. Caleb stood and walked to the door. He opened it just enough to let his voice cut through the gap, cold and final. She doesn't belong to anyone, he said, and every word was a stone thrown with perfect aim. Not you. Not me. Not a piece of paper. Lenora's face appeared in the crack of the doorway, her eyes bright with something that looked like fear pretending to be rage. Then why are you doing this? She hissed. Caleb's stare didn't waver. Because it's right. Lenora's lips curled back from her teeth. Men don't do right for free. Caleb's voice dropped lower, colder. Get away from this door before you embarrass yourself more than you already have. Lenora's breath hitched like she had been slapped across the face. Then her footsteps retreated, fast and angry, the sound fading down the hall like a storm moving on. Caleb closed the door and turned back to May. His face was calm again, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands flexed once like he was letting go of something he wanted to hold on to. You leave tonight, he said, if you want to. May's chest tightened. If I stay. You'll be punished, Caleb said simply, like it was a fact as certain as rain or death. She won't forgive you for being seen, for mattering. She'll make your life smaller and meaner until there's nothing left of you. May felt her throat burn. The truth was a hard thing to swallow, but it was still truth. Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat again, nervous and small. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Hawthorne may contest this in. Let her, Caleb said, cutting him off without heat. I have my own counsel, and I have proof that your office received notice of this contract years ago and chose to ignore it. The lawyer went very still. His mouth opened, then shut. A sheen of sweat rose on his forehead despite the cool air. May's mind swirled with words she didn't fully understand. Papers, contracts, rights. It all felt like a language she wasn't allowed to speak, a world she had never been invited into. What do you want from me? May asked, and her voice shook despite her best effort to steady it. She hated that it shook. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not desire, something else, something like recognition. I want you to stop thinking you owe the world an apology for your own breath, he said, and his voice was rough now, like the words cost him something. I want you to be safe. That's what I owe, by law and by my word. May stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. And if I don't want to be under your word? His expression didn't change, but his tone softened just enough to let her know he had expected the question. Then you take the settlement, he said. You walk away. You live how you choose. But you won't walk back into her house. Not alone. Not unprotected. May's eyes stung. She blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains, low and long, like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the storm. Caleb nodded once, like he had decided something on his own. "Pack what you need," he said. "No more than you can carry." May hesitated. Her voice came out small. "I don't have much." Caleb's mouth tightened, and those two words seemed to land on him like stones. "I know." And what happened next would reveal just how deep the promises ran, and how far Lenora was willing to go to make sure May never escaped the shadow she had been forced to live in. Because the secrets buried in that contract weren't just about money or land. They were about a debt that had been owed for 20 years, and the price of that debt was about to come due in ways no one in that house could have predicted. May moved down the hall toward the back of the house, her steps feeling wrong, like she was walking through someone else's dream. The kitchen smelled of onions and stale bread, and the cook, old Mrs. Danner, stood by the stove with her hands in flour, her eyes wide as saucers. "I heard," Mrs. Danner whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain outside. May forced a small nod and slipped past, her heart hammering in her chest. Her room was tucked behind the pantry, small and cold under a slanted roof. It smelled like soap and loneliness. The rain made the roof tick and moan like it was in pain. May pulled her worn carpet bag from under the bed and began packing with shaking hands. 3 dresses, a nightgown, 2 pairs of stockings, a brush with missing teeth. Then she knelt and lifted the loose floorboard by the wall, the one she had discovered years ago and kept secret. Her fingers found the little tin box she had hidden there. Inside was her mother's locket, tarnished and dull but still the most precious thing she owned. A few pencils wrapped in cloth. 2 small books she had bought with coins saved over years. Her hands trembled as she placed them in the bag. A soft knock came at the door. May froze. The door opened a crack, and Mrs. Danner slipped inside. Her eyes were wet, red-rimmed. She held out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen twine. "Your mother's recipe pages," Mrs. Danner whispered, her voice fierce despite the tears. "She wrote them down before she passed. I kept them. I always meant to give them to you." May stared at the bundle like it was something holy. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Mrs. Danner said, and now her voice was steel wrapped in kindness. "You take them and you go. Don't you look back, you hear me? Don't you dare look back." May's throat closed up completely. She nodded once, because if she tried to speak, she would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Mrs. Danner pulled her into a quick, tight hug. Flour dust clung to May's sleeve, and the hug was brief, but it felt like someone finally telling her she was worth something, worth remembering, worth fighting for. When May stepped back, Mrs. Danner wiped her face roughly with the back of her hand. "He's waiting," she said. May lifted her bag. It felt impossibly light, for a whole life. Too light, like she was leaving behind more than she was taking. But maybe that was the point. She walked out the back door into the wet night. The cold rain hit her face like a baptism. A wagon waited in the yard, its canvas cover pulled tight against the weather. A lantern hung on the side, swaying slightly in the wind. 2 men in rough coats stood by the horses, their faces shadowed but their presence steady and quiet, like soldiers waiting for orders. Caleb stood near the wagon wheel, rain sliding off the brim of his hat. He looked at her bag, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted. "That's all?" he asked, and his voice was careful, like he was trying not to sound angry on her behalf. May nodded. "That's all I own." Caleb's eyes flashed with something dark and fierce. Not at her, at the world, at the people who had made her small. He reached up and offered his hand again. "Step careful," he said. May took it, and he lifted her into the wagon like she weighed nothing at all. The horses snorted, restless and ready to move. The men climbed up front without a word. May looked back once. Just once. Hawthorne Manor loomed behind her, lights glowing in the windows like eyes watching. She could almost feel Lenora somewhere inside, standing at a window, watching May leave and already planning how to drag her back. Because women like Lenora didn't let go of control easily. They held on with claws, and they didn't care who bled. Caleb climbed into the wagon beside her. Not too close. but close enough that the heat of him reached her through the damp air. The wagon jolted forward, and May's stomach flipped as the manor started to fall away into the rain and darkness. She swallowed hard. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice barely louder than the sound of the wheels on the muddy road. "Caleb," he corrected, his eyes still fixed on the dark road ahead. "Caleb." She tried again, and the name felt strange on her tongue. "Why did you say I inherit your protection?" His face was half shadow under the canvas cover. His eyes looked forward, watching the road like it was something alive that might change its mind about where it led. "Because," he said after a long pause, "my name is the only shield your stepmother fears." May's chest tightened. "And if she fights you?" Caleb finally turned to look at her. His gaze was steady, but something wounded lived underneath it, something old and scarred. "Then she'll learn," he said quietly, "that I don't break my word." The wagon climbed into the mountain night, pulling away from the only home May had ever known. The wind howled through the trees like a warning, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. May hugged her bag to her chest and tried to breathe, because she wasn't sure what scared her more, the life she was leaving behind, or the life waiting for her at the end of this road with a man she didn't know, bound by promises made before she was even born. And what she didn't know yet, what no one had told her, was that Caleb Rourke had his own ghosts, his own debts, and bringing May into his world meant opening doors he had spent years keeping locked. But those doors were about to swing wide open, whether either of them was ready or not. The wagon climbed for hours through wet, narrow roads carved into the mountainside. Pine trees stood dark and tall on either side, their branches heavy with rain. The wind shoved fog between them like smoke, thick enough to cut with a knife. May sat with her bag in her lap, listening to the rattle of the wheels and the steady breathing of the horses. Every few minutes, thunder rolled somewhere far off, like the mountains were talking to each other in a language she didn't understand. Caleb didn't speak much. He watched the road like it was a living thing that required constant attention, but he kept his body angled between May and the open side of the wagon, as if the storm itself might reach in and try to take her. Near midnight, the rain finally thinned. The fog opened in a slow tear, and May saw lights ahead. Not town lights. Warmer. Steadier. Lanterns on posts. Firelight glowing in windows. A house rose out of the trees, built of log and stone, set high on a slope like it had grown there naturally. A wide porch wrapped around it, and smoke curled from a chimney into the wet night. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and something clean and sharp that made May's lungs feel bigger. Her breath caught. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard. Men appeared from the direction of a barn, moving quick and sure with lanterns in their hands. They didn't stare at May like she was strange or unwelcome. They didn't look away like she was something shameful. They simply nodded, like she had been expected all along. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was older, maybe 50, with a sturdy build and hair pinned back in a no-nonsense bun. Her apron was tied tight, and her face was kind in a way May had almost forgotten existed. Not soft, not pitying, just solid and real. "Mr. Rourke," the woman called out, her voice carrying over the rain. "You're soaked clean through." Caleb jumped down from the wagon first, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "Evening, Mrs. Bear," he said, and his voice softened just a fraction when he spoke to her. "I need a room made ready." Mrs. Bear's eyes moved to May, and they warmed immediately. Not with curiosity, with understanding, like she already knew the shape of May's story without needing to ask. "And this will be Miss May," she said, like the name belonged in her mouth, like it had been waiting there. "Come along, honey," Mrs. Bear continued, gesturing toward the door. "You look half frozen." May hesitated. Her legs felt weak after the long ride, and her hands were stiff from gripping the bag too tight for too long. Caleb offered his hand without a word. She took it, and he helped her down with the same careful strength he had shown before, like she was something that could break, but also something worth protecting from breaking. The cold mountain air bit at her cheeks. It carried the scent of wet earth and horses and smoke, and underneath it all, something May couldn't quite name. Freedom, maybe, or the possibility of it. May stood in the yard, staring at the porch and the lit windows and the steady people moving around her with purpose. She felt like she had stepped into someone else's life, like this couldn't possibly be meant for her. Mrs. Bear took her arm, gentle but firm, the way you'd guide someone who was lost. "You're safe here," she said quietly, close to May's ears so only she could hear. "No one will harm you under this roof." May's throat tightened until it hurt. She nodded because she couldn't trust her voice to work. Inside, the house was warm in a way Hawthorne Manor had never been. Fires burned in 2 stone hearths. The floors were clean pine, scrubbed and cared for. The walls held simple things: old maps, a few family portraits, a rifle rack, a carved wooden cross. The air smelled like soap and pine, and stew simmering somewhere nearby. Mrs. Bear led May down a short hallway and opened a door. May stopped dead in the doorway. The room was bigger than her entire space back at the manor. A real bed with thick quilts piled high. A basin with water already steaming, waiting. A small table set with bread and soup and sliced apples arranged on a clean plate. A towel folded neatly like it mattered. Like she mattered. May stared at it all as if it might vanish the moment she blinked. Mrs. Bear set May's small bag on a chair and turned to face her. "Eat," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Washington sleep. We'll talk in the morning." May swallowed hard. "Thank you." Mrs. Bear's eyes softened even more. "Mr. Rourke doesn't bring trouble home," she said, and there was certainty in every word. "So if he brought you, you're not trouble. You're his responsibility, and that means you're ours, too." The words hit May harder than any insult Lenora had ever thrown at her. They reached into a place she had kept locked and broke something open. She pressed her lips together and nodded again, not trusting herself to speak without breaking completely. When the door closed and May was finally alone, she stood in the middle of the warm room. The quiet felt different here. Not sharp, not waiting to punish her. Just quiet, soft, safe. Her body finally gave up the fight it had been waging all day. Tears came fast and hot, and so full of shame, she wanted to disappear. She sank onto the edge of the bed and covered her face with both hands, trying to muffle the sound because old habits died hard. She cried for her mother's face, which she could barely remember anymore. For the years she had stood in doorways like she didn't deserve to enter rooms. For the word nothing, spoken out loud like it was her name. For her father, who had been too weak or too afraid to love her the way she needed. And she cried because, for the first time in her life, she was sitting in a warm room that felt like it had been made ready just for her. Like she was worth the trouble of clean sheets and hot water and food that wasn't leftovers. When the tears finally ran out and left her empty and exhausted, May washed her face in the warm water. She ate every bite of the soup, even though her hands shook. And then she fell asleep under quilts so heavy they felt like protection, like arms holding her safe through the night. But outside, in the darkness beyond the firelight, the mountains held secrets of their own. And Lenora Hawthorne was already writing letters, already making plans, already sharpening the weapons she would use to drag May back into the shadow where she belonged. Because women like Lenora didn't accept loss quietly. They fought dirty, and they fought to win. And the battle for May's future was only just beginning. Morning came pale and cold, the storm finally spent. May opened the curtains and saw the mountains bathed in fresh snow on their upper ridges, bright against a sky the color of steel. Pine trees stood sharp and clear, and the world looked scrubbed clean, like it had been waiting for this moment to show itself. She dressed in her old clothes, feeling suddenly out of place again in this beautiful room. A soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Bear entered with a folded dress draped over her arms. Simple, new, dark green like pine needles and shade. May stared. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Mrs. Bear said, her voice matter-of-fact and brooking no argument. "Mr. Rourke told me to make sure you had what you needed. He didn't say to ask permission." May's cheeks warmed. "He planned this." Mrs. Bear snorted softly, something that might have been amusement. "He plans everything. It's how he survives." May took the dress with careful hands. The cloth was soft but sturdy. The stitching was strong and even. It fit like someone had guessed her size perfectly, which shouldn't have been possible but somehow was. "How?" May began. Mrs. Bear lifted one eyebrow. A woman who's watched another woman for 10 minutes can guess her size, child. Now hurry. He's waiting in the dining room, and the bacon's getting cold. May walked into the dining room on legs that didn't quite feel like hers. A long table sat near a window with a view of the valley below, all green and white and endless. Plates were set, coffee steamed in heavy mugs, bacon sizzled on a platter, and there were eggs and biscuits and jam in a small glass jar. Caleb stood by the window, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hair still damp at the ends from washing. He turned when she entered, and for a second his face went very still. May felt it. He saw the change. Not because the dress was pretty, but because she looked cared for, because someone had thought about her comfort and acted on it. Caleb cleared his throat. Morning. Morning. May answered, her voice steadier than she expected. He pulled out a chair for her. The simple action made her heart beat too hard in her chest. No one had ever done that for her without making it feel like a joke or a mockery. They ate in silence, but it wasn't a cruel silence. It was just two people learning the shape of a new life, finding their footing in unfamiliar territory. After breakfast, Caleb slid a letter across the table. This came at dawn, he said, his voice flat and controlled. May's fingers stiffened before she even touched it. The seal was from Denver. Official. Legal. She opened it carefully, her hands already beginning to shake. The words were sharp and precise, written in a lawyer's hand. Lenora was contesting everything, calling May illegitimate, claiming Caleb was holding her against her will, threatening court proceedings and public shame and consequences that would ruin both of them. May's hands began to tremble so badly, she almost dropped the letter. Caleb watched her, his eyes steady and calm. She's trying to scare you back, he said. It says kidnapping, May whispered, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. It's a lie, Caleb said simply. But lies can still make noise, May said, her voice rising with panic. What if the town believes her? What if they? Then the town learns the truth, Caleb said, cutting her off gently but firmly. May looked up at him, fear climbing up her throat like ivy. And if the truth still isn't enough? Caleb's jaw tightened. Then I stand between you and them. May stared at him, and a question rose in her chest that she was almost afraid to ask. Why? He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked like old pain mixed with new determination. Because I promised, he said. The word should have been comforting. It was, in a way. But it also hurt, because a promise meant duty. It meant obligation. It meant he was doing this because he had to, not because he wanted to. May folded the letter with slow, deliberate movements. Will this ruin you? She asked quietly. Caleb's eyes darkened. I've been called worse than a thief, he said. It didn't kill me. May nodded, but her stomach still churned with fear and guilt. That week, Rourke Ranch settled around May like a world she was learning to read. She helped Mrs. Bear with household accounts without even thinking about it, because numbers were a language she trusted more than words. She found a small room with a desk and paper, and she drew the mountains until her fingers ached and her mind felt quieter. She walked the porch in the evenings, listening to the wind in the pines, trying to believe she was actually allowed to be here, that this wasn't a dream she would wake from and find herself back in that cold room behind the kitchen. And slowly, the way she carried herself began to shift, not because she became louder or bolder, but because she became real. She stopped flinching quite so much when footsteps came behind her. She started meeting people's eyes instead of staring at the ground. And once, just once, she laughed at the barn when a goat stole a biscuit from one of the ranch hands and ran like it knew exactly what crime it had committed. Her own laughter shocked her most of all. Caleb noticed these things. He didn't speak them aloud, but May could feel his attention like warmth from a fire. The way he paused when he heard her laugh. The way his shoulders relaxed, slightly, when she walked into a room. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to yet. Then one afternoon, Caleb returned from checking the timberline with mud on his boots and a look on his face that made the whole house go quiet. We're going into Denver, he said. May froze with a pencil in her hand, halfway through sketching a pine branch. Why? Caleb set his gloves on the table with deliberate care. "Because the judge is there," he said, "and because Lenora is telling her story to anyone who will listen." May's stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. A town full of people. Eyes. Judgment. Whispers. "Yes," Caleb said, reading her face. "And you'll walk in beside me." Fear rose in her chest, like smoke filling a closed room. "They'll stare." "Let them," Caleb said. May swallowed hard. "What if I can't? What if I—" Caleb stepped closer, and his voice dropped lower, more intimate. "You lived in a house that trained you to disappear," he said. "But you're not disappearing anymore. Not while I'm breathing." The word sent a strange heat through her chest that felt like safety, and also like something more dangerous. Something she didn't have a name for yet. And what May didn't know was that the gathering in Denver would become the turning point. The moment when everything she thought she knew about her father's promises, about Caleb's motives, and about her own worth would be tested in front of a room full of people who had already decided she was nothing. But this time, she wouldn't be standing alone. This time, she would have a choice about who she wanted to be. And that choice would change everything. The day of the gathering was bright and bitterly cold. The streets of Denver were packed with wagons and horses, people moving in thick groups, with their coats buttoned tight against the wind. The air smelled like coal smoke, and roasting chestnuts and wet wool. A hotel ballroom had been opened for a business supper, the kind where ranch owners and timbermen and mining bosses shook hands and made deals that would shape the territory for years to come. May stood in a small room upstairs, staring at herself in a mirror that showed her a version of herself she didn't quite recognize. Mrs. Bear had pinned her hair neatly, and the silver locket her mother had left her rested at her throat. May's fingers touched it like it was proof she was still herself underneath all this fear. A knock came at the door. Caleb's voice, quiet and steady on the other side. "May, we're ready." May's throat went dry. She opened the door. Caleb stood in a clean coat, his shoulders squared, his presence the kind that made people step aside without thinking about it. His eyes moved over her face, and something softened in his expression. "You look fine," he said, and the plainness of it almost made her laugh. "Almost. I feel like I'm stepping onto a stage," May said. Caleb offered his arm. Then we stepped together. May took his arm, and the solid warmth of him steadied her more than she wanted to admit. Downstairs, the noise hit them like a physical thing. Dozens of voices, laughter, the clink of glasses, and underneath it all, the hum of gossip and speculation. Dozens of eyes turned the moment they appeared in the doorway. May felt it in her skin, that weight of attention. Whispers started before they even crossed the threshold. "That's her. The one from Hawthorne Manor. Rourke brought her. Is it true she has no claim?" May wanted to shrink. Every old instinct screamed at her to make herself invisible, to disappear into the wallpaper. But Caleb's arm stayed steady under her hand, solid as a mountain, and he didn't slow his pace or look away from anyone. Inside the ballroom, light from chandeliers glinted off silver and glass. The air smelled like perfume and wool and roasted meat. Men in fine coats stood with their wives, all of them smiling too wide, their eyes too sharp. And then May saw Lenora. Her stepmother stood near the center of the room, dressed in black silk that looked expensive and elegant, like mourning was a fashion statement instead of grief. Her face was calm, but her eyes were predatory and sharp. Vivian stood beside her with her chin lifted, playing the role of devoted daughter. Eliza stood a step behind, her hands clasped tight, looking like she wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. Lenora's gaze slid over May, and her smile appeared, cold, ready, triumphant. She moved toward them as if she owned not just the room, but the entire city. "Caleb Rourke," Lenora said, her voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "How bold of you to show your face here." Caleb didn't smile back. "Evening, Mrs. Hawthorne." Lenora's eyes flicked to May, and her expression turned into something crueler. "And there she is," she said, loud enough for nearby conversations to pause and listen. "The poor girl you've stolen." May's breath caught in her chest. Caleb's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. "No one stole May." Lenora leaned in just enough for her words to carry to the people pretending not to listen. Then she came willingly, she said, and her tone dripped with insinuation. A woman who knows her place would have stayed. May felt the old shame try to claw its way up her throat. Then she caught Eliza's face. Pale. Sorry. And May understood something in a sudden, clear flash of insight. Lenora lived on fear. She needed May to bow so Lenora could stand tall. She needed someone beneath her to prove her own worth. May's fingers tightened around Caleb's arm. Not to hide, to steady herself. Lenora raised her voice a little more, feeding the room's hunger for scandal. Tell them, May, she said, her smile sharp as broken glass. Tell them you belong to a contract and a man's papers. Tell them you're not doing this for attention or... The room held its breath. Caleb's body went rigid beside her, like he was ready to cut Lenora down with words that would leave scars. But May surprised them both. She stepped half a pace forward, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Her voice was quiet at first, but it carried in the sudden silence. I didn't come for attention, May said. Lenora's smile sharpened, victory already forming on her lips. Then why are you here? May swallowed once. Her hands trembled, but she kept them at her sides where everyone could see. Because I was told my whole life that I was nothing, May said, and the words felt like pulling shards of glass from her chest. And today, I'm done living like that. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not laughter, not mockery, something else. Something that felt like recognition. Like maybe other people in this room knew what it felt like to be made small. Lenora's eyes flashed with anger barely contained. You're ungrateful, she hissed. May's voice came steadier now. Maybe, she said. Or maybe I'm just finally honest. Lenora's face tightened like a fist. You have no right. Caleb stepped forward then, and his voice cut through the room, like a blade through silk. She has every right, he said. And if anyone here wants to question her claim, they can question mine in court, with lawyers, with witnesses, with everything I've kept quiet out of respect for the dead. Lenora's mouth opened, but she recovered fast, turning to the crowd with that polished town voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. You all know Caleb Rourke, she said. He buys what he wants. He takes what he wants. Don't pretend this is charity. Caleb's eyes didn't blink. His voice didn't rise. It isn't charity, he said. May's chest tightened, waiting for the blow. Lenora tilted her head, her smile venomous. Then what is it? Caleb's answer came slower this time, like he was choosing each word with care. Like the answer wasn't meant for the room at first. It was meant for May. It started as a promise, he said. A debt I meant to pay. May felt the sting of it settle in her chest. Then Caleb's voice changed. Rougher. More real, more human. But it stopped being a debt, he said, and now he was looking at her, not at Lenora, not at the room, because she's not a paper to be filed. She's not a mistake to be corrected. She's a woman who survived a house that tried to erase her, and I won't let anyone break her again. The room went absolutely still. May looked at him, and her breath stopped in her lungs. She saw it in his eyes then. Not duty, not obligation. Something real and raw and terrifying. Fear. Hope. Something he'd been holding back because saying it out loud made it real, made it vulnerable. Lenora's smile faltered for the first time all night. You can't protect her forever, she snapped. And now there was panic underneath the venom. People will talk. They'll ruin her. They'll ruin you. Caleb's gaze never left May's face. Let them talk, he said quietly. I'm done living for other people's comfort. The words hit May like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and for the first time in her entire life, she believed that someone might choose her, not because they had to, not because of a contract or a promise made before she was born, but because they wanted to, because she was worth choosing. Lenora's face turned hard and ugly. Fine, she said, her voice cracking at the edges. Choose her and see what it cost you both. She turned away with a sweep of expensive silk, pulling Vivian with her. Eliza lingered for just a second longer, her eyes on May. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something kind, something human, but she didn't. She just gave May a small, sad look that might have been an apology, or maybe just recognition of what she lacked the courage to do herself. Then she followed. The air in the room slowly began to move again. People started breathing. Conversations restarted, softer now, different, changed. May stood there with her legs weak beneath her, her whole body shaking from the effort of staying upright. Caleb leaned in close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You did good," he said. May's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. "I thought I would faint." "You didn't," Caleb said. "You stood." May turned her head to look at him, really look at him, and the words came out before she could stop them. "You said it stopped being a debt." Caleb's jaw tightened. He glanced around the room once, then gently guided her toward a quieter corner, away from the eyes and the noise and the weight of all that attention. When they reached a shadowed alcove near a tall window, Caleb stopped. His hands flexed at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. "I don't say things easy," he admitted, his voice rough. "I wasn't raised to." May's breath came shallow. "Neither was I." Caleb gave a short smile that didn't last. "I brought you to Rourke Ranch to keep you safe," he said. "That was the plan. Keep the promise. Honor the contract. Do what was right." May swallowed hard. "Caleb." He looked at her then, and it was like looking at something raw and unguarded. "But somewhere in there," he said quietly, "you started making it feel like a home again. And I don't know when it happened, but it did." May's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her fingertips. "That's not what I want to hear," she whispered. Caleb nodded slowly, like he understood the risk now, like he knew this was the moment that could break everything or build something new. His voice dropped even lower. "What I want," he said, and the honesty in it was almost painful, "is to wake up and know you're still there. Not because a contract says you must be, because you choose it." May's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back anymore. "I've never been chosen," she whispered. Caleb stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Then let me be the first," he said. And in that moment May Larkin, who had spent her entire life being told she was nothing, realized that she was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the shadows, to safety through invisibility, to a life where she would never be hurt because she would never be seen. The other path led toward something terrifying and real and utterly unknown. She could choose to believe him, or she could protect herself by walking away. The choice was hers, and for the first time in her life, that choice felt like freedom.